The fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport buzzed overhead as Dr. James Chen stood in the security line, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly against the polished floor. His shoulders ached from the weight of his carry-on bag, and the exhaustion from his 16-hour flight from Singapore hung heavy on his face. The last few days had been a whirlwind, performing a groundbreaking surgery that could change the face of modern medicine, followed by barely enough time to pack his bags and catch his flight back to New York. He checked his watch again, trying not to let anxiety creep in. In just 4 hours, he was expected at Mount Sinai Hospital for an emergency consultation. A young patient with a rare brain condition needed his expertise, and every minute counted. The thought of the waiting child gave him the energy to stand straight despite his jet lag. Around him, the usual morning crowd pushed through security, business people in crisp suits tapping away at their phones, families trying to wrangle excited children, college students with oversized backpacks. Dr. Chen had done this routine hundreds of times before. As one of the top neurosurgeons in the world, international travel was part of his life. Still, something felt different today. He noticed TSA officer Richard Miller before Miller noticed him. The officer stood at his station with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance, his eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk searching for prey. Dr. Chen had dealt with power-hungry security personnel before, but something in Miller's gaze made him grip his passport a little tighter. The line moved forward slowly. Dr. Chen watched as Miller processed other passengers, quick, almost careless checks for some, slightly longer pauses for others. The pattern wasn't subtle. A well-dressed businessman in front of Dr. Chen barely got a glance at his documents before being waved through. The elderly Indian woman after him received a bit more scrutiny, but still passed quickly enough. Then it was Dr. Chen's turn. Papers, Miller barked, not even looking up at first. When Dr. Chen handed over his passport and credentials, Miller's entire demeanor shifted. His eyes narrowed, and he straightened up, suddenly very interested in every detail of the documents before him. Purpose of your visit to Singapore? Miller's voice carried across the security area, unnecessarily loud. Several nearby passengers glanced over. I performed emergency surgery at Singapore General Hospital. Dr. Chen replied quietly, maintaining his professional composure. He'd learned long ago that staying calm was the best response in situations like this. Miller's eyebrows shot up with obvious disbelief. You? A surgeon? He flipped through the passport pages again, slowly this time, as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. And what kind of surgery would that be? Dr. Chen could feel more eyes turning toward them. The businessman who'd passed through earlier was now watching with poorly concealed interest. A young mother pulled her child closer, as if the scene unfolding was something her daughter shouldn't witness. It was a specialized neurosurgical procedure, Dr. Chen explained, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. I developed the technique myself. The patient had a rare condition fat. A lot of fancy words there. Miller cut him off, his tone dripping with skepticism. Mind explaining why these credentials are from New York if you're doing all this important work in Singapore? The question was ridiculous. International medical cooperation was common in specialized fields, but Dr. Chen knew this wasn't really about his credentials. He'd faced this kind of treatment before, though rarely so blatantly. His hand moved unconsciously to straighten his tie, a nervous habit from his residency days. I'm chief of neurosurgery at Mount Sinai Hospital, he said, pulling out his hospital ID. I travel frequently for complex cases that require my specific expertise. All my paperwork is in order, and I have an urgent case waiting for me. Miller held up his hand, silencing him. Sir, step aside, please. We'll need to verify these documents. He emphasized the word sir in a way that made it sound like anything but respect. Dr. Chen's legs felt heavy as he moved to the side. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably the hospital checking on his arrival time. The young patient's scan results would be ready by now, and the surgical team would be waiting for his input. But here he stood, watching as Miller made a show of scrutinizing every page of his documentation. Other officers at nearby stations had noticed the situation. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to see. A younger officer started to approach, perhaps to help speed things along, but Miller waved him away with a sharp gesture. Time seemed to slow down. Dr. Chen thought about the patient waiting at Mount Sinai, another child whose parents were counting on him. He thought about the successful surgery he'd just completed in Singapore, about the family's tears of joy when he told them their daughter would make a full recovery. He thought about his own journey from a small apartment above his parents' restaurant to becoming one of the most sought-after neurosurgeons in the world. The fluorescent lights continued their endless buzzing. Somewhere in the distance, a flight departure was announced. A child laughed. Life went on around them while Miller held Dr. Chen's future in his hands, wielding his small amount of power like a weapon. Dr. Chen's thoughts drifted to his father's words from long ago. Success isn't just about achieving things, it's about how you carry yourself when the world tries to push you down. Standing there, watching Miller's theatrical display of authority, he held onto those words like a lifeline. His white coat, carefully folded in his carry-on bag, felt worlds away. In it, he was unquestionably Dr. Chen, respected surgeon, trusted with the most delicate organ in the human body. But here, under Miller's scrutiny, he was just another target, another chance for a small man to feel big. The irony wasn't lost on him, that hands trusted to perform microscopic surgery on the human brain were now being treated as suspicious. That a man who had given talks at the world's top medical institutions was being spoken to like a criminal. That someone who had saved countless lives was being viewed as a threat. Yet he stood tall, kept his breathing steady, and waited. Because that's what his parents had taught him, what life had taught him. Dignity isn't given by others, it comes from within. And no amount of humiliation could take that away from him. Little did Officer Miller know that this moment, this small power play in a busy airport, would soon become a turning point in both their lives. But for now, Dr. Chen simply waited, watching the clock tick away precious minutes, holding on to his father's words and his own hard-won sense of self-worth. The morning crowd continued to flow around them, like a river splitting around a rock, each person carrying their own story, their own destination. And in that moment, Dr. Chen was both the rock, immovable, dignified, and the water, knowing that this too would eventually pass. Officer Miller held Dr. Chen's passport up to the light for the third time, turning it this way and that as if expecting the pages to reveal hidden secrets. The morning rush had slowed to a trickle, but the audience to this unnecessary spectacle hadn't diminished. If anything, the slower pace meant people had more time to stare, to whisper, to judge, though it wasn't Dr. Chen they were judging. These stamps, Miller said, his voice carrying across the security area like a bullhorn, they seem awful frequent for a doctor. Don't you have patients to take care of back home? The question dripped with suspicion, as if frequent international travel was somehow proof of wrongdoing rather than evidence of Dr. Chen's expertise. An older couple nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. The husband started to step forward, then thought better of it when his wife grabbed his arm. Dr. Chen noticed these small gestures of sympathy, these tiny rebellions against injustice, but kept his focus on Miller's face. He'd learned long ago that in moments like these, maintaining eye contact was its own form of dignity. "I travel because patients need me," Dr. Chen replied, his voice steady despite the fatigue weighing on his shoulders. "Last week, it was a 12-year-old girl in Singapore. Next week, it might be someone in London or Dubai. Disease doesn't care about borders." Miller's lip curled slightly. Pretty fancy words there. "But you know what I see? I see someone with an awful lot of stamps in their passport. Someone who's always on the move. Someone who saves lives," a voice interrupted. A young man in scrubs had stopped on his way through security, his ID badge identifying him as a resident at a local hospital. Miller shot him a glare that sent him scurrying along, but the moment had broken his rhythm. Dr. Chen's phone buzzed again in his pocket. Mount Sinai would be wondering where he was. The young patient's family would be waiting, hoping, praying for the expertise that was currently being held hostage by prejudice disguised as procedure. "Your medical license," Miller continued, holding up the document as if it was something suspicious. "Issued in New York, but you claim to operate all over the world? That doesn't add up." A bead of sweat rolled down Dr. Chen's back. The air conditioning seemed to have failed in his particular corner of JFK, though everyone else looked comfortable enough. He thought about the surgery he'd just completed in Singapore, 14 hours of intense concentration, working at the very limits of medical science to save a young life. How strange that those 14 hours felt easier than these few minutes under Miller's scrutiny. International medical licenses are quite common in specialized fields, he explained, knowing the explanation was falling on deliberately deaf ears. I can show you my credentials from the World Medical Association, my hospital privileges in various. Oh, I'm sure you have plenty of papers, Miller cut him off, emphasizing the word papers like it was something dirty. People like you always do. But my job is making sure they're real papers. The phrase, people like you, hung in the air like smoke, choking the space between them. A mother quickly covered her child's ears, hurrying past. A group of teenage girls stopped their chatter, their faces showing a sudden loss of innocence as they witnessed real-world prejudice in action. Dr. Chen thought about his own father, who had faced moments like these with quiet strength, who had built a life in this country through determination and dignity, teaching his son that success meant rising above, not fighting back. But standing here now, watching Miller deliberately mishandle his credentials, he wondered if rising above was enough anymore. Sir, he said, injecting his voice with the same calm authority he used in the operating room, I have a patient waiting. A child with a rare brain condition that requires immediate attention. Every minute we spend here. Oh, so now you're saying I'm preventing a child from getting medical care. Miller's voice rose, drawing even more attention. Maybe if you had proper documentation, we wouldn't be having this problem. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone watching. Dr. Chen's documentation was probably more extensive than any other passenger's, multiple medical licenses, hospital credentials, international certificates of excellence. Yet here they were, locked in this absurd dance of power and prejudice. A supervisor hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. The morning light streaming through the airport's windows has shifted, marking the passage of precious time. Dr. Chen could feel his patience, normally endless in the operating room, beginning to fray at the edges. Officer Miller, he said, reading the name tag he'd been staring at for what felt like hours, I understand you have a job to do. But I also have a job. Right now, there's a family waiting to hear if their child's condition is operable. There's a surgical team waiting for my consultation. There's a young life hanging in the balance. Something flickered across Miller's face, doubt, perhaps, or maybe just annoyance at Dr. Chen's continued composure. He shuffled the papers again, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced as the confrontation dragged on. Well, if all this is real, Miller said, gesturing vaguely at the credentials spread before him, then surely you understand why we need to be thorough. Can't be too careful these days. Need to make sure people are who they say they are. The words might have sounded reasonable if everyone hadn't just watched him wave through dozens of other passengers with barely a glance at their documents. If he hadn't been performing this theatrical investigation for nearly 30 minutes. If his tone hadn't carried that edge of satisfaction that comes from exercising power over someone you've decided doesn't deserve respect. Dr. Chen's hands, capable of the most delicate surgical procedures, steady even in life and death situations, had begun to tremble slightly. Not from fear or anger, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. Here he was, hours after performing revolutionary surgery, being treated like a suspicious character in a bad movie. The buzz of his phone had become more insistent. The hospital would be getting worried now. The patient's family would be wondering why the famous surgeon they'd pinned their hopes on hadn't arrived. And Officer Miller continued his performance, each minute adding to a delay that could have real consequences for real people. Yet something in Dr. Chen remained unbroken. Perhaps it was the memory of all the patients he'd helped, their faces forming a shield around his dignity. Perhaps it was his father's voice in his head, reminding him that true strength shows itself in moments of unfairness. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that this moment, like all moments, would eventually pass. The morning sun continued its climb, casting long shadows through the airport windows. Somewhere beyond these walls, life went on. Hearts kept beating, brains kept thinking, and somewhere, a child waited for the help that was currently being delayed by nothing more than prejudice wearing a badge. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow harsher as the confrontation entered its next phase. Officer Miller had moved from examining Dr. Chen's documents to questioning every aspect of his recent trip to Singapore. The growing crowd of onlookers had created an unofficial arena around them, with Miller playing to the audience like a performer who'd forgotten this wasn't supposed to be entertainment. So you expect me to believe, Miller said, tapping Dr. Chen's passport against his palm, That some hospital in Singapore just called you up and asked you to fly halfway around the world for one surgery. His voice carried that special kind of skepticism reserved for things he already decided not to believe. Dr. Chen felt the weight of his sleepless night pressing down on him. The coffee he'd managed to drink on the plane had long since worn off, leaving him running on nothing but determination and the knowledge that another patient needed him. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of all the times he'd stayed calm during complex surgeries. This was just another test of patience. "Yes, that's exactly what happened," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "The patient had a rare condition called—" "Spare me the medical mumbo-jumbo," Miller interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "What I want to know is why they couldn't find a doctor closer to home. Seems mighty suspicious to me." A few feet away, Miller's supervisor shifted uncomfortably. He'd been watching the scene unfold for several minutes now, his face showing the internal struggle between doing what was right and avoiding conflict with a subordinate. Dr. Chen caught his eye, but the supervisor quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his clipboard. "There are only 3 surgeons in the world who can perform this particular procedure," Dr. Chen explained, fighting to keep the exhaustion from his voice. "I developed the technique myself. The patient's family had been searching for help for months before they found me." Miller's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Oh, so now you're telling me you're some kind of special genius, one of only 3 people in the whole world." He turned to his colleague at the next station, encouraging him to join in the mockery. The other officer gave a weak smile but kept his attention on his own work. The morning had fully arrived now, sunlight streaming through the high windows and creating patterns on the floor. Dr. Chen watched a patch of light slowly move across his shoe, thinking about how time was slipping away. His phone had stopped buzzing, probably because the hospital had given up on reaching him. The thought of the waiting patient and family made his chest tight. "I can show you the medical journals where the procedure was published," Dr. Chen offered, reaching for his laptop bag. "I have copies of—" "Stop." Miller's sharp command froze him mid-motion. "Keep your hands where I can see them. No sudden movements." The absurdity of the situation hit a new high. Here he was, a surgeon whose hands were trusted with the most delicate organ in the human body, being treated like he might pull a weapon from his bag of medical journals. A few gasps came from the crowd of observers, and someone muttered, "This is ridiculous," just loud enough to be heard. The supervisor finally took a half step forward, then stopped as Miller held up a hand. "I've got this under control," Miller assured him, though nothing about the situation suggested control. If anything, it was spinning further into a circus of prejudice and power play. "Sir," Dr. Chen tried again, his fatigue making his voice rougher than usual, "I have an emergency consultation waiting at Mount Sinai. A child with a condition similar to my patient in Singapore. Time is extremely important in these cases." "Oh, so now you're trying to make me the bad guy?" Miller's voice rose slightly. "Trying to blame me if something happens to this supposed patient? That's a pretty low tactic, don't you think?" Dr. Chen closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he opened them, he noticed a young woman in scrubs standing nearby, her phone partially raised, as if she was considering recording the scene. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a small shake of his head. The last thing he needed was this moment going viral, distracting from his work, his patients, his mission. The air in the security area had grown thick with tension. Other officers had slowed their processing, half listening to the ongoing drama while pretending not to. Passengers who had cleared security lingered at the nearby coffee shop, sipping drinks that had gone cold as they watched the scene unfold. "Officer," Dr. Chen said, switching tactics, "I understand you have concerns. But surely there must be a way to verify my credentials that doesn't involve delaying urgent medical care. I can have the hospital call to confirm my identity. Or my surgical team in Singapore." "Oh, now we're getting somewhere," Miller interrupted, his tone suggesting he caught something suspicious. "So you've got people ready to vouch for you? All lined up and ready to go? That's mighty convenient, isn't it?" A child in the security line started crying, perhaps picking up on the tension in the air. The mother tried to quiet him while simultaneously trying to avoid drawing Miller's attention. Dr. Chen watched as she wrapped her arms protectively around her son, and he thought about all the parents he'd met in his career, their fear, their hope, their trust in his abilities to help their children. The supervisor had pulled out his phone and was typing something, glancing between his screen and the ongoing scene. Maybe he was finally preparing to intervene, or maybe he was just documenting the incident for some future report that would be filed away and forgotten. Dr. Chen's legs had begun to ache from standing so long. The weight of his carry-on bag, still slung over his shoulder, felt like it had doubled since this ordeal began. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the weight of time passing that pressed down on him. Somewhere in the city, a family was waiting for answers he couldn't give them because he was stuck here, caught in someone else's power play. The morning light had shifted again, marking another quarter-hour lost to prejudice and paperwork. Dr. Chen thought about all the times in his career when minutes had made the difference between success and failure, between hope and heartbreak. And here he stood, watching precious time slip away, all because one man had decided his face didn't match his credentials. Time had begun to lose meaning in the bubble of tension that had formed around the security checkpoint. Dr. Chen's fingers had gone numb from gripping his passport too tightly, and the edges of his vision had started to blur from exhaustion. That's when he heard it, a gasp that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a surgical blade. "Oh my God, Dr. Chen." A young nurse in light blue scrubs had stopped dead in her tracks, her carry-on bag dropping to the floor with a thud. "Is it really you?" Officer Miller's head snapped up, his attention momentarily diverted from his theatrical investigation of Dr. Chen's documents. The nurse was already pushing her way forward, her face lit up with recognition and disbelief. "I can't believe it's you," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "You probably don't remember me, but you saved my little brother's life last year. The tumor that nobody else would touch. You operated for 16 hours straight." The security area had gone quiet. Even the constant airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if the universe itself wanted to hear the story. Dr. Chen studied the nurse's face, memories slowly surfacing through his jet-lagged haze. "Room 712, he said softly. "Your brother loved space. He had all those planet stickers on the ceiling above his bed." Tears welled up in the nurse's eyes. "You remember? He's starting college next month, astronomy, of course. The doctors said he wouldn't live to see his next birthday, but you proved them wrong." Miller stood frozen, his authority suddenly diminished by the raw emotion of the moment. He still held Dr. Chen's passport, but his grip had loosened, the documents nearly slipping from his fingers. The nurse turned to address the crowd that had gathered, her voice carrying with the strength of someone used to speaking up for her patients. "Do you know what this man did? When every other surgeon said the tumor was too risky to remove, Dr. Chen spent 3 days studying my brother's case. He developed a new surgical approach just for him. The technique he created is now saving lives all over the world." People had stopped pretending not to stare. A businessman who'd been typing on his laptop closed it slowly, his eyes fixed on the scene. A group of flight attendants paused their hurried walk to their next flight, drawn in by the nurse's words. "The night before the surgery," she continued, wiping tears from her cheeks, "Dr. Chen sat with our family for 2 hours, explaining every step of the procedure. He drew diagrams on a napkin so my parents could understand. They barely spoke English, but he was so patient, making sure they understood everything." Dr. Chen felt a familiar warmth in his chest, not pride, but the simple satisfaction of knowing he'd helped someone. It was the feeling that drove him through those long hours in the operating room, that pushed him to take on cases others deemed impossible. "My brother was his last patient that day," the nurse said, now addressing Miller directly, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "But Dr. Chen had been operating since dawn. 16 hours of absolute precision, standing there saving my brother's life while most people would have been exhausted. And you know what he did after the surgery?" Miller shook his head slightly, seemingly unable to find his voice. "He waited with us in recovery. He'd been on his feet for almost 20 hours, but he waited because he knew how scared we were. He didn't leave until my brother opened his eyes and squeezed his hand." The supervisor had finally moved closer, his clipboard forgotten at his station. Other TSA officers had stopped pretending to work, all eyes now focused on this unexpected moment of truth. "And now," the nurse continued, her voice cracking with emotion, "I see this same man. This surgeon who saved my brother and so many others, being treated like She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone watching knew exactly what she meant. Dr. Chen gently touched her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "Your brother's recovery is what matters. How is his headache situation? Has he had any more vision problems?" The simple question, so professional, so caring, asked even in the midst of this humiliating situation, seemed to break something in the atmosphere. A woman in the crowd dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The businessman who'd been watching closed his laptop completely and shook his head, muttering under his breath. "He's perfect," the nurse replied, smiling through her tears. "No headaches for 6 months now. His vision is 20/20ths. He's going to study the stars, Dr. Chen. You made that possible." Miller's face had gone pale, the enormity of his mistake finally beginning to sink in. The passport in his hands, the same one he'd been treating like evidence of some crime, now seemed to burn his fingers. The supervisor finally found his voice. "Officer Miller," he said quietly, "I believe we verified Dr. Chen's credentials sufficiently." The words were professional, but the tone carried a weight of reprimand that everyone could hear. But Dr. Chen's attention was still on the nurse. "Make sure your brother wears eye protection during his astronomy observations," he said, his doctor's instincts overriding everything else. "The surgical site is fully healed, but it's still good practice too." His words were cut off by another buzz from his phone. Reality crashed back in. There was another patient waiting, another life hanging in the balance. The nurse seemed to realize this too, her expression shifting from joy to concern. "Oh God, they're waiting for you at the hospital, aren't they?" she asked, her medical training kicking in. "How long have you been held here?" She turned to Miller, her earlier emotion hardening into professional urgency. "Do you realize what you're doing? There could be another family waiting right now, hoping for the same miracle my brother received." The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, its rays now streaming directly through the airport windows, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. In that light, everyone could see the truth, not just about Dr. Chen, but about the prejudices that had led to this moment and the cost of allowing such biases to go unchecked. The supervisor's footsteps echoed across the now quiet security area as he finally approached Dr. Chen and Officer Miller. His face had changed. Gone was the hesitation from earlier, replaced by an urgency that seemed to age him by years. He held his phone in his hand, screen still glowing from what must have been a very important call. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice carrying a mix of respect and regret, "I just got off the phone with Mount Sinai Hospital." He shot a sharp look at Miller, who still stood holding the passport like it might burn him. "They've been trying to reach you for the past hour." Dr. Chen felt his heart sink. An hour lost to prejudice. An hour that could have been spent saving a life. Before he could respond, the supervisor continued, his words tumbling out with increasing urgency. "The patient you're supposed to see, it's Officer Thompson's daughter, from the afternoon shift." The supervisor's voice cracked slightly. "Little Emmy, she's the one waiting for your consultation." The impact of these words rippled through the crowd. Officer Thompson was well known among the airport staff, a friendly face who always brought homemade cookies during the holidays, who kept pictures of his daughter on his phone and showed them to anyone who would look. Miller's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Emmy Thompson," he whispered, the name seemingly stuck in his throat. "But I heard she was seeing some specialist." "Yes," the supervisor cut in sharply, "she's seen the world's leading specialist in pediatric neurosurgery. The same specialist you've been detaining for the past hour because you couldn't believe someone who looked like him could be that accomplished." The nurse who had recognized Dr. Chen earlier pressed her hands to her mouth, understanding the full weight of the situation. Around them, other airport staff who knew Officer Thompson began to whisper, the news spreading like ripples in a pond. Dr. Chen remained silent, watching the realization wash over Miller's face. He'd seen this expression before, the moment when prejudice crumbled in the face of personal connection. It wasn't enough, it was never enough, but it was sometimes the start of change. "Emmy's case," Dr. Chen finally said, his voice gentle despite everything, "is similar to one I just treated in Singapore. That's why I rushed back. The procedure I developed there might be her best chance." A woman in a flight attendant's uniform wiped tears from her eyes. "Officer Thompson has been working double shifts to pay for her treatment," she said softly to no one in particular. He brings her here sometimes during his breaks. Such a bright little girl. The supervisor had moved to his computer terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Dr. Chen, I'm expediting everything right now. We'll have you through security in 2 minutes. He paused, looking up with tired eyes. I'm so sorry about this. If I had known sooner. But Dr. Chen's attention was on Miller, who looked like he might be sick. Officer Miller, he said quietly, I understand you were doing your job. But every minute we spend questioning someone based on their appearance is a minute that could cost someone else their chance at life. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. A truth that went beyond this moment, beyond this airport, beyond even little Amy Thompson waiting for her chance at healing. Miller finally looked up, meeting Dr. Chen's eyes for the first time, really seeing him, perhaps for the first time. I didn't know, he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. That's exactly the point, the nurse interjected, her voice firm but not unkind. You didn't know. You didn't know that my brother is alive because of Dr. Chen. You didn't know that Officer Thompson's daughter needs him. You didn't know that while you were questioning his credentials, somewhere in Singapore, a family is celebrating because their daughter just woke up from successful surgery. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, streaming through the airport windows and illuminating the scene in unforgiving clarity. In that light, everyone could see the cost of prejudice written on their faces, the wariness in Dr. Chen's eyes, the shame in Miller's posture, the worry in the supervisor's frown. A young custodian who had been watching the scene unfold spoke up unexpectedly. My cousin had brain surgery last year at Mount Sinai, he said, his voice quiet but clear. The doctors there talk about Dr. Chen like he's some kind of miracle worker. They say he takes the cases nobody else will touch. More voices joined in, a chorus of revelations. My neighbor's son. I read about his technique in the news. Didn't he win that big medical award? The security checkpoint had transformed into something else, a space where truth was breaking through barriers built by prejudice, where human connection was dissolving years of ingrained bias. Dr. Chen checked his phone again, thinking of Amy Thompson and her father waiting at the hospital with hopes as fragile as butterfly wings. He thought about all the other Officer Millers in the world and all the other patients waiting for help that might be delayed by prejudice. The supervisor finished his typing with a decisive click. Dr. Chen, you're cleared to proceed. We've arranged for express transit to Mount Sinai. He turned to Miller, his voice taking on an edge of steel. Officer Miller, we'll discuss this incident in detail during your performance review. But Dr. Chen wasn't quite finished. He turned to Miller one last time, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used with frightened patients. Officer Miller, when you finish your shift today, I want you to think about something. Think about how many times you've made assumptions like this. Think about how many lives might have been affected, and then think about Amy Thompson and how close you came to delaying her chance at healing. The words weren't spoken with anger or accusation, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who had faced such prejudice before and understood its true cost. In that moment, surrounded by the morning light and the weight of revelation, something shifted in the atmosphere of that small corner of JFK International Airport. Officer Miller stood frozen in place as Dr. Chen gathered his belongings, the weight of reality crushing down on him like a physical force. The morning light streaming through the airport windows felt harsh now, exposing every flaw in his actions, every crack in the facade he built around his prejudices. His hands shook as he mechanically returned Dr. Chen's documents, the same papers he'd spent an hour questioning, mocking, doubting. Each movement felt like it was happening in slow motion, his mind stuck on a loop of horrible realization. He had almost prevented Amy Thompson from getting the help she desperately needed. Amy Thompson, sweet little Amy, who sometimes sat at his security station during her dad's breaks, drawing pictures with the crayons he kept in his desk specifically for her visits. The same little girl who had given him a handmade birthday card last month, covered in wobbly stars and hearts. The child whose father worked double shifts and overtime, who talked about his daughter's upcoming special doctor appointment with hope in his tired eyes. Miller started to speak, but the words died in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he explain to Officer Thompson that he had nearly sabotaged his daughter's chance at healing because of his own biases? The supervisor was efficiently processing Dr. Chen's security clearance, his movements quick and precise. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had begun to disperse, but their whispers lingered in the air like smoke. "Can't believe he treated Dr. Chen like that. Poor Officer Thompson. What if it had been my child waiting?" The young nurse who had recognized Dr. Chen was helping him organize his papers, her movements gentle but hurried. "The surgical team will be ready," she assured him. "I can call ahead to let them know you're finally coming." Miller watched as she handled the same documents he had treated with such suspicion just minutes ago. Her touch was respectful, almost reverent. She understood their true value. Each paper represented not just credentials, but lives saved, families given hope, children like Amy Thompson given a chance at a future. "Officer Miller." Dr. Chen's voice cut through his spiral of shame. The surgeon had paused in his preparations to address him one final time. "There's something else you should know." Miller looked up, bracing himself for well-deserved anger or condemnation. Instead, he found Dr. Chen's eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding that made his guilt even harder to bear. "Your niece's case," Dr. Chen said quietly. "The one scheduled for next month at Mount Sinai. I'm the surgeon assigned to her procedure." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Miller grabbed the edge of his security station for support, his legs suddenly unable to hold his weight. How did you know about?" "Your supervisor mentioned it while verifying my credentials," Dr. Chen explained gently. The timing finally made him intervene. "She has the same condition as Amy Thompson, doesn't she?" Miller nodded numbly, unable to speak. His sister's face flashed through his mind, her tears when she'd called to tell him about the diagnosis, her joy when Mount Sinai had accepted the case, her hope when she'd learned about the revolutionary new surgical technique that might save her daughter's life. The same technique he had mocked just an hour ago when Dr. Chen tried to explain his work in Singapore. "The procedure I developed there," Dr. Chen continued, his voice still carrying that same gentle authority, "the one you found so hard to believe in, it's what gives both girls their best chance." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's why I rushed back. That's why every minute counts." The supervisor had finished processing the paperwork. A special escort was already waiting to rush Dr. Chen to the hospital. But the surgeon wasn't quite finished. "Your niece's surgery is scheduled for the 15th of next month," he said, pulling out a business card and writing something on the back. "This is my direct number. Call my office later today. We'll move her procedure up. She shouldn't have to wait if we can help her sooner." Miller stared at the card being held out to him, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. After everything he'd done, after the way he treated this man. "Why?" he managed to whisper. "Why would you help her after how I?" Dr. Chen's response was immediate and firm. "Because she's not responsible for your actions today. Because she deserves the same chance as every other child. And because maybe, Officer Miller, this is how change begins, when we realize that the lines we draw between us and them are imaginary, and that we're all connected in ways we never expect." The business card felt impossibly heavy in Miller's hand. Around them, the airport had begun to return to its normal rhythm. Passengers hurrying to gates, security lines moving forward, life continuing its endless flow. But in this small corner of JFK, time seemed to stand still as Miller faced the full weight of his transformation. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, the words feeling painfully inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Chen. I never thought. I didn't realize." "I know," Dr. Chen replied simply. "But now you do, and that knowledge comes with responsibility. Remember this moment, Officer Miller. Remember it the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance. Remember it when you see others doing the same." The escort was getting anxious, checking his watch repeatedly. Dr. Chen gathered his belongings, preparing to finally continue his journey to Mount Sinai, to Amy Thompson, to all the patients who needed him. "One last thing," he said, turning back to Miller. "When your niece comes in for her surgery next month, I hope you'll be there. Not just as her uncle, but as someone who understands the cost of prejudice and the value of change." As Dr. Chen finally walked away, Miller stood rooted to his spot, the business card in his hand and the weight of transformation on his shoulders. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but now it felt less like an accusation and more like an invitation to see the world and himself in a new light. 2 months had passed since that transformative morning at JFK International Airport. The surgical wing at Mount Sinai Hospital buzzed with its usual quiet energy as Officer Miller walked through the halls, a small teddy bear clutched in his hands. His police uniform was replaced by civilian clothes, but his steps still carried the same measured pace of someone used to walking with authority. This time, though, that authority felt different, humbled, changed. He passed the waiting room where, just weeks ago, he had sat with his sister while Dr. Chen operated on his niece. The surgery had been a complete success. His niece was already back in school, complaining about homework instead of headaches. The memory of Dr. Chen's kindness, his willingness to move up the surgery date despite everything, still brought a lump to Miller's throat. Today was Amy Thompson's follow-up appointment. He had asked for the morning off specifically to be here, to support his colleague's daughter just as Officer Thompson had supported him during his niece's surgery. The bear in his hands was identical to the one that had helped his niece feel brave before her operation. As he approached the pediatric wing, he had a familiar laugh, bright and clear, unmarked by pain or fear. Amy Thompson sat in the children's play area, building a tower of blocks with another young patient. Her father stood nearby, talking quietly with a nurse, his face relaxed in a way Miller hadn't seen in months. "Uncle Rick," Annie called out when she spotted him, using the nickname she'd given him during her many visits to his security station. The blocks forgotten, she ran to give him a hug, her movements free and energetic, so different from the careful way she had moved before the surgery. "Hey there, superhero," Miller replied, his voice rough with emotion. He held out the teddy bear. "Brought you a little friend. He's extra brave, just like you." Officer Thompson walked over, clasping Miller's hand in a warm handshake. The two men had grown closer over the past months, their shared experience creating a bond that went beyond workplace friendship. "Dr. Chen's running a bit late," Thompson explained, smiling. "He was up all night doing another emergency surgery. Some kid from Boston. They flew him in specially." Miller nodded, understanding now what that meant in a way he never had before. He thought about all the Dr. Chens of the world, rushing between hospitals, crossing borders, fighting exhaustion to save lives. And all the Officer Millers who might be standing in their way because of prejudice and preconceptions. The waiting room television played quietly in the background, showing a news report about a breakthrough in pediatric neurosurgery. Miller caught a glimpse of Dr. Chen on the screen, speaking at a medical conference, sharing the technique he developed, the one that had saved both Amy and Miller's niece. "You know," Thompson said quietly, watching his daughter show her new teddy bear to her play companion, "I never told you this, but I was there that morning." At the airport. Miller's heart skipped a beat. You were?" Thompson nodded. "Had just finished my night shift. Was heading out when I heard the commotion." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I almost stepped in, but then I saw something in Dr. Chen's eyes. He was handling it with such dignity, such patience. Even though he knew my Amy was waiting." The shame Miller had carried these past months rose up again, but Thompson wasn't finished. "But you know what really got me? What really showed me the kind of man Dr. Chen is?" He turned to face Miller fully. "It was when he heard about your niece. How he didn't hesitate to help her, even after everything. That's when I knew Amy was in the right hands." Before Miller could respond, the elevator doors opened and Dr. Chen stepped out. He looked tired but satisfied, the way he often did after a successful surgery. His eyes lit up when he saw Amy, who was already running toward him with her new teddy bear. "Dr. Chen, look what Uncle Rick brought me," she exclaimed, holding up the bear. "He's brave like me." Dr. Chen knelt down to Amy's level, examining the bear with the same careful attention he gave to his medical charts. "Very brave indeed," he agreed solemnly. "Just like his owner." He looked up, catching Miller's eye, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The past 2 months had changed something fundamental in their relationship. Miller had attended every hospital board meeting where Dr. Chen presented, learning about the revolutionary procedures he was developing. He'd read every article he could find about the surgeon's work, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect and interest. More importantly, he'd started speaking up at the airport. When he saw other officers showing the same biases he once had, He shared his story. He told them about Amy Thompson and his niece, about the precious minutes wasted by prejudice, about the lives that hung in the balance while they questioned credentials based on appearance. "All right, Miss Emmy," Dr. Chen said, standing up. "Ready for your checkup. I hear you've been doing great in physical therapy." As Amy skipped into the examination room, her father following close behind, Dr. Chen paused next to Miller. "The cultural sensitivity training program you proposed for the airport security staff, the board approved it yesterday." Miller straightened up, surprised. He'd spent weeks working on that proposal, drawing from his own experience to create a program that might help others avoid making the same mistakes he had. "Thank you for letting me use your story," he said quietly. It's making a difference." Dr. Chen smiled, that same gentle, understanding smile he'd shown at the airport 2 months ago. "No, Officer Miller, you're making a difference. By choosing to learn from that day instead of trying to forget it. By helping others understand what you came to understand." The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, catching the silver in Dr. Chen's hair, earned through countless hours of saving lives, of standing up to prejudice with dignity, of changing the world one patient, one person, one Officer Miller at a time. In the examination room, they could hear Amy chattering happily about school, about her dreams of becoming a doctor, just like Dr. Chen. Her voice, full of hope and possibility, was the sound of a future where appearances mattered less than actions, where prejudice gave way to understanding, where transformation was always possible. And in that moment, standing in the warm sunlight of a busy hospital corridor, Officer Miller understood that true change wasn't just about one dramatic moment of revelation. It was about all the moments that came after, the daily choices to be better, to do better, to help others learn what you had learned. The bear in Amy's arms, the smile on Dr. Chen's face, the hope in Officer Thompson's eyes. These were the real badges of honor, the true measures of authority. They were reminders that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of humility, and that redemption often begins with the simple courage to face our own prejudices and choose a different path.